sure do appreciate everybody making the effort to come here, and Nathan and Caleb's arms are really tired from flying all the way from Texas, and the rest of y'all. So we really do appreciate it, and hopefully this is going to be beneficial and kind of eye-opening to everybody. I want to ask Caleb, if you will, to please pray for us before we get started.
Our loving Father in heaven, thank you so much for being with us this morning, and thank you for the life and the breath that you're providing us each day. And thank you so much for the time that you've given to us to come together as your children to study the Word. Our Father, please give us the understanding of this humanism and how that's affecting our lives as a Christian. And please give us the defense that we can protect ourselves and our children from getting corrupted by this world. And please bless ourselves. Bless us that we would have our eye open to the things that, what kind of attacks that these humanists are attacking these Christians. Please, Father, that we would come out from this world and be separated from them and not touch any unclean things, that so that we can be holy and righteous nation unto you. We ask you to please bless at this time, and please bless all the speakers, that they would present well, and also that we would be very informed from the things that we listen to. Please bless the whole day to go well. In Jesus' name we pray.
All right. Hopefully everybody got some good sleep last night. We have quite a bit to cover today. I think folks know what the topic of the day is, humanism, and we're going to start out having an overview of what humanism, what it's about, what its aspirations are for everybody, and but we're gonna kind of start out asking the question: why are we spending this whole day talking about humanism? And it really goes back to what the Lord warns us about here in Colossians 2 and verse 8, where he tells us we need to beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of man, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. And we're going to see a lot of statements put out by the humanists and different forms that, we'll see a lot of language. And one of the common themes, I'll probably bring it up several times, is, their language can be very wishy-washy. And, it can look very appealing until you start looking more closely and you start putting things together and you realize what they're getting at. Sometimes it's pretty blunt and it's pretty obvious, but then there's other times where you can tell that they're really trying to reach out and appeal to different ones to try to get them to join in with this philosophy of humanism. And we're going to see that that humanism is one of the largest and most prevalent systems of unbelief in God in the world today. It's everywhere. And if you look for the little symbol here, I think they call it the happy humanist symbol, the little H here at the bottom. You'll see there's a lot of companies actually that kind of insert those in different places. There's a lot of corporate support for humanism. There's a lot of religious bodies that support humanism. There's a lot of government that supports humanism. It's pervasive, and we want to understand just how pervasive it is and what it's all about. So we'll start with the definition, and these definitions come from their own information. It's very easy. They're very open about this. There's no secrets here. You can go to the American Humanist Association. They have a big website. Every country has websites that go in great depth. They have lots of articles about how wonderful humanism is, and we'll talk more about that as well. But and they don't have just one definition. This is their first number one in their dictionary, so to speak. This is their first definition, but it's quickly followed by a whole lot of other perspectives from different individuals that are humanists describing what their definition of humanism is. But sort of the official one for the American Humanist Association is that it is a progressive philosophy. Progress. That sounds good, doesn't it? Well, we'll talk about how good progressive is. So it's a progressive philosophy that, without theism or other supernatural beliefs, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. Now, if you sort of held your hand over this little part of the sentence there, and you just read that last part about leading ethical lives and aspiring to do good. Well, that kind of sounds nice, doesn't it? I mean, can we see how that would the average person would see that and would be they would have some appeal to that and say, well, that's a good thing. Having ethical lives and trying to do good. And we need to again realize that with humanism, they're all about they're the ones that get to define what good is, and we'll see, especially maybe in John's lesson later on the morality part, where their definition of good is it good, John? No, it's not. It's not very good. So what? And I will be touching on some of the lessons that John and others do. This is intended kind of as an overview. I'm sure I'll step on John's toes and some other toes here a little bit, but we're all going to blend a little bit. Here's another statement from the same organization where it says what their goal is. Okay, we strive to bring about a progressive. There's that word again. Society where being good without a God is an accepted way to live life. We are accomplishing this. Now, these are some of the different ways that they're accomplishing it. It's through our defense of civil liberties. Well, again, that's something that at first thought you think, well, civil liberties, we all have, should have rights, and it's good that they're defending our rights and allowing us to, free speech and things like that. Well, again, this is within what they want and what they define as having liberties to do. And they certainly want to take some liberties that, as Christians, we ought not to be even thinking about. So, through their defense of civil liberties and secular governance, by our outreach to the growing number of people without traditional religious faith, and through a continued refinement and advancement of the humanist worldview. So, they're really working towards this worldwide embracement of humanism. That's one of the things that they're working towards, and we're going to see more about that later. Here's another statement that kind of illustrates their focus on not just one area, one nation or another, but it's a worldwide thing. They say here it's a philosophy, a joyous service for the greater good of all humanity, of application of new ideas, of scientific progress for the benefit of all. So, again, the average person that really doesn't know much about God and what God's purpose is going to see things like that, and what are they going to think? Well, that sounds like a good thing to think about, is the greater good for everybody. And we're seeing more and more people in the world that are going off after this kind of thinking, this kind of philosophy. They go on to talk about how, across the world, humanists are a big family and how they treat each other as a family. They describe themselves as a safe place where members can respectfully be uniquely themselves. And of course, these days we know that means, well, you can go off and be whatever you want to be, and you will be welcomed as one of the members of their humanist family.
Except conservative.
What is that?
Except conservative.
Except conservative, right. Well, don't forget about that non-theistic part. That's part of their definition. As long as you're non-theistic, you're part of the family.
Yes.
Disagreements are okay among themselves because each person is loved. So what a wonderful group we have here. Humanists all love each other so much. They listen without judgment. every individual is recognized for the gifts that they bring to the society. They're aiming for a progressive society that is without, and that is what they are all about, is trying to have the world become a place where God is completely out of the picture. They make it very, we are living the only life we'll have in the only world that we know about. So for them, there's the humanist organization. So there's many different organizations that the humanists are very glad to accept all as part of their group, because they all have that same fundamental belief that there is no God, there is nothing after this, and it's all about the rules for this life. This sounds a lot like what the world was in the days of Noah, or perhaps the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, the things that were going on there. We have going gods, but that was pretty progressive for their time, wasn't it? And what about Israel doing the same thing? They have these philosophies. They say ethics is autonomous. That means we decide. And it is situational. So it depends on the situation as to whether it's right or wrong. What humanism is. Later, Potter became the founder, this was in 1938, of the Euthanasia Society of America. So we'll see with a lot of these big names that they are best capable of developing values. They're pretty proud of themselves. Everybody, we're both from maybe North Carolina area around Raleigh and so on, but very common and more common to see these kinds of things where they're trying to reach out to the masses to get them to think about this philosophy of humanism, and that there is a way to, quote, be acceptable without believing in God. Now, naturally, when they're putting their emphasis on so-called reason and so-called science, they have to come up with some explanation as to how we've gotten here, right? And so it's very natural for them to put their weight on these ancient theories that were developed back in the 1800s that are way, way outdated, but that yet everybody seems to be completely sold on, i.e. evolution. And so evolution is a key part of their belief system, because if there's no God, then how did we get here? And that's their typically their rote answer. So that's actually Manifesto 3, is that evolution is part of that. And so the natural progression then is, well, if you don't have a God and you believe that we've evolved, kind of the next steps in their thinking are, well, we control our destiny. And you'll see those kinds of statements that they have, but that is the, hey, there's plenty of folks that don't believe in God. It's not a problem to join that club. So again, humanism, the first 5 letters, well, it's all about humans. It's all about us. And so they talk about what is it that makes a fulfilling life for us. And they say it emerges from individual participation in the service of humane ideals. We aim for our fullest possible development, finding wonder and awe in the joys and beauties of human existence. So they're looking for anything that tries to make this life better, according to their definition, more enjoyable, right? And it's all about serving mankind. And we'll see that as a continuing theme as well. Going back to the very first manifesto that they wrote back in 1933 concerning religion, they said, believing that religion must work increasingly for joy in living, religious humanists aim to foster the creative in man and to encourage achievements that add to the satisfactions of, and getting everybody hooked on those things rather than, it's the light of my life and the felt conviction in every fiber of an uncaring physical world, and it is love coupled with empathy, democracy, and a commitment to selfless service which undergirds the faith of a humanist. Again, I said this lady sounds like a preacher, right? I mean, she's better than a lot of preachers I've heard. But, I mean, here we see a humanist, a person that is non-theistic, has no belief whatsoever in God. And what is she talking about? She's talking about her soul. She's talking about reason for existence. She's talking about love and empathy and selfless service. I mean, wow, that sounds really good, doesn't it? And unfortunately, it does sound good to a lot, right? That can't discern the difference between what our Creator has set for us to do and this flowery, hypocritical, superficial language that's being put out. But you can see that it is and Brother Brett has a lesson later that gets more into the aspects of humanism being a type of a religion. And you can see statements like this that really illustrate that is how people view it. Another statement on their site here, a little nice, concise summary. Humanism is, in sum, a philosophy of those in love with life. Kind of reminds you of some scriptures, doesn't it? Like love not the world and things. One humanist who made the statement, who says, "I'm not in search of sanctity or sacredness or purity. These things are found after this life, not in this life, but in attitudes of worship and prayer, and how it's something that's been around for a long, long time, and it has been. And you have this kind of thinking that's been around for quite some time. And so they're trying to latch into that and make people believe that, oh, this is acceptable. This is something that's been around. Must be okay. But again, we realize from our Creator, well, that's not at all true. We realize from Ephesians chapter 4 that, as we read here, that, well, what is our measure? Or who is our measure? Christ is our measure, right? And that is our aim, right? We all need to be coming, as he says there, to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect, unto a complete man. And he defines what he means by that here at the end of this verse. He says, until we come to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. And of course, we all understand how we all need to be measuring against Christ and looking at his heart and looking at our hearts and looking at, well, what do I need to change to be conformed to the image of my Master? Christ is our measure, not man. And so again, we can see how humanism is diametrically opposed to anything that has to do with Christianity. And they know it, and we know it. And so there's a battle for our souls and the souls of our children. One of their slogans that they actually, for the American Humanist Association, they actually have this as kind of the tagline under their title, is that you can be, quote, good without God. And, it's up, basically what this means is up to them to define what is good, what is moral, what's not moral. And Brother John is going to talk more about that in a later session. We'll see them, again, we have to realize just because you read a word, don't assume that they're thinking the same thing you are when you read the word. And so when they talk about humanism being a philosophy of compassion, don't assume that their meaning for compassion is the same as what we understand for compassion. They go on here to describe how their ethics are solely concerned with meeting human needs. For both the individual and society. And then they kind of add this little dig, and it says that it devotes no attention to the satisfaction of the desires of a supposed theological entity, right? So, they get those, digs in wherever they can to try to emphasize, we don't believe in any God. All of our ethics are derived from ourselves, and we have compassion. And they should talk about that when they're advocating abortion and things like that. But so again, we don't be. We have to point out to ourselves and to our children, don't be misled by the wording on the page. Right? Think about the things that they're doing, and think about how misleading a lot of their wordings are. The other thing we need to really and want to focus on here in the last few minutes is the fact that this is not just some passive philosophy that you can study at school and you can take it or leave it. That's not at all humanism. Humanists are very, very organized. They're very much set out to change the world, and we find humanism active everywhere. And certainly it didn't start here, but this is certainly became very public in the U.S. Starting around 1933 when they published their first manifesto. Obviously, it was going on long before that. We have some quotes from even back in the early 1800s where people were talking about some of the techniques that would be used to persuade the world to accept humanist values. But it became very public starting in 1933 with the first manifesto, and then 40 years later there was the Manifesto 2, and then 40 years after that in 2003 we have the Manifesto 3. So maybe in 2043, it seems like 40 years is their rate here. No telling what they're going to have in that. But they're very clear about their goals. Have our leaders talking about the New World Order. This is something that's been around for a long time in the Humanist Manifestos. The Manifesto 2 back in 1973 had quite a bit to say about this. What did they say there? Well, they said, first of all, we deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. We hate nations. Well, what did the Lord say in Acts chapter 17 in verse 26? He says, the Lord has made of one blood all nations on the face of the earth, and He's set them on this earth that they should seek the Lord. Right? So here's the Lord's plan, where He has created all these nations, and He has a very specific purpose. And here's the humanists that come along and say, we hate this. Okay? We deplore it. And they go on and they say, we've reached a point where the best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and to move towards the building of a world community in which all sectors of the human family can participate. Thus, we look to the development of a system of world law and a world order based on transnational federal government. So they see a one world government as being the thing that the way it should be in their view of humanist utopia. And so that's literally one of the things that they are working towards is this new world order. And part of what they realize is needed to get there is this. It says the world must be open. Again, this comes straight from the Humanist Manifesto 2. The world must be open to diverse political, ideological, and moral viewpoints and evolve a worldwide system of television and radio. And they didn't have the internet back then, but guess what other word would have been on there, if it was written today, right? They understand, and we're thinking, well, how are we going to propagate this philosophy that we need to have this new world order where God is no longer what is in men's minds and folks are focused on the philosophy of humanism? Well, we're going to need this worldwide system of television and radio so that we can propagate this message. And we'll see many faces that they use to propagate this. Some of us may recognize quite a number of these faces, but these are all ones that have specifically been named as Humanists of the Year by different organizations or have various accolades by the humanists as being ones who lived the humanist life and promoted their ideals. We have very well-known folks like Albert Einstein and then Carl Sagan. We have some recent additions like Anthony Fauci. We have Ted Turner, very well-known businessman here, especially in Atlanta, founded CNN. He's also a man that said Christianity is a religion for losers. He didn't think much of Christianity, right? But he thought a lot about humanism, and he received a lot of positives from the humanist organizations for his great work. Jonas Salk was another humanist. Bill Nye, why pick Bill Nye? Well, who's Bill Nye talking to? He had a kids television show for quite a number of years, right? And what do you think he's talking about in those kids shows, right? Well, certainly the humanists recognized the value and named him Humanist of the Year. I forgot which particular year it was, but they recognized the value. Somebody asked, why do I have the picture of the Star Trek Enterprise here at the bottom? Anybody want to venture a guess there? Anybody hear about a man named Gene Roddenberry? He was the creator of the Star Trek series. He was also a sort of a militant humanist, and he really patted himself on the back how he was able to get some of the humanist things under the radar at that time, back in the 1960s. Some of the things that were, and some of the themes of some of those Star Trek movies were things that were not really acceptable to put on media at the time. And so he was very happy that he was able to get across some of his themes about how religion is just something for primitive people and things like that. And all of the episodes had various themes, and those themes were all very much anti-religious, very humanistically oriented. And so the humanists recognize that, and they, in their write-up about Roddenberry, they say he was one of the most influential yet unheralded humanists of the 20th century. So, and why was that? Well, he had millions of people watching this series that was promoting these godless societies, right? And that was getting people to think about, well, this is really cool, and you have this whole generation that grew up as known as Trekkies, right? This whole culture, so to speak, or cult, truly a cult following of Trekkies that were so wrapped up in this series. And what was it promoting? It was promoting humanism, right? And all of the Roddenberry was very explicit about his intentions, that it was completely intentional to put those themes in those shows. It was not by accident by any means. And so the humanists recognized that and awarded him because of that. So we need to realize that when they make this statement that they needed to establish a worldwide system of television and radio, that they knew how to use it, and they've been using it, and they continue to use it very, very successfully. They're pushing this agenda in many, many different ways through our governments and schools and churches and media. It's pervasive throughout the world. You can go out and look on the websites, and you can see humanist organizations in I forgot how many countries now, but it's 100 plus different countries that have humanist organizations. We've done this presentation in India and talked about some of the specific organizations there that the humanists support, things like women's welfare centers and health clinics and libraries, educational facilities, art centers. They're combating against the caste system, discrimination based on just where you were born and so on. So they're involved in all of these things, but they have their motives as they're getting involved in all of these things. And as they're doing these things, it's unfortunate that they seem to be having a good bit of success. Some of the studies, for example, this was a study actually from several years back, show that the number of Americans, or percentage of Americans claiming to be religious, dropped about 13% over a 7-year period. And at the same time, atheists, the number of ones claiming to be atheists, rose from about 1 to 5%. If you break that down by age groups, you can sort of predict this, right, just on how we see things unfolding, right? Those of us that are a little bit older, we realize, well, there's more people thinking about, the end is coming, right? And they're I need to be ready. Not so much though in these younger generations, right? And there's as you get into the younger generations, there's just about a third at this point of this poll that say, nah, they're not affiliated with any religion at all. So we need to recognize that these efforts that are going on through the various forms of media are having an effect, and we need to be, especially those of us as parents and grandparents, need to be on guard, realizing that there's so many different forms of influence out there, and we need to not be under any false understanding that they're being very intentional about this. And so we'll look at some statements here now specific to the school system and how the school system is being used and how they realize how important this is. So this is from one of the humanists here that he points out and says, I think the most important factor moving us toward a secular society has been the educational factor. So they see education in schools as the number one way to convert, right? And he points out, says, our schools may not teach Johnny to read properly. We certainly hear a lot about that, don't we? He says, but the fact that Johnny is in school until he's 16 tends to lead towards the elimination of religious superstition. So they realize that by the time they get kids through school, they've been able to work this superstition out of them. Here's a quote that goes back to somebody that lived in the 1800s. So this is just kind of to point out, this isn't some new thing that has come along the last few decades. Here he says, our great object was to get rid of Christianity and to convert our churches into halls of science. The plan was not to make open attacks on religion, but to establish a system of state schools from which all religion was to be excluded and to which the parents were to be compelled by law to send their children. For this purpose, a secret society was formed and the whole country was to be organized. So, we see here that folks have been trying to organize these societies to get influence these public schools and getting people to be forced to go to school and to hear these attacks on Christianity. Here's a quote from Andrew Carnegie, and here he says, men of wealth should form a synthetic, free enterprise system based on cradle-to-grave schooling. The people who advance through schooling will be given licenses, we could call that degrees, to lead profitable lives. All licenses will be tied to forms of schooling. This way, the entire economy can be controlled and people will have a motivation to learn what you want them to learn. It also places the minds of all the children in the hands of a few social engineers. So here was Andrew Carnegie, very powerful industrialist from the early 1900s. It's unfortunate that these ideas that he had didn't go away when he went away, right? Today we have, the Carnegie Foundation, right? Does work in cooperation with other ones like the Ford Foundation or there's many Rockefeller Foundations. All of these foundations from these very powerful industrialists. If you go look at their websites, they're all about the same thing, and they're all about this. They're all about humanism and promoting these social agendas in the world. So very, very powerful individuals over time, and unfortunately their wealth that they amassed then went into sustaining the institutions that continue to have a great deal of influence today. We see some pretty wild statements coming from some of these men, but we need to realize that these men are in positions of, if I could push the right button, it might help. Let me get back here.
You got it.
Okay. So here's a Nebraska state senator who also happened to be a humanist. He was speaking back in the 1980s, right? His belief was that fundamental Bible-believing people do not have the right to indoctrinate their children in their religious beliefs. He says, because we, the state, are preparing them for the year 2000, when America will be part of a one-world global society, and their children will not fit in. So these Christians, they're just not going to fit into this one-world society that is humanist, right? And these leaders who were in positions of power to affect direction on these kinds of things were making those statements very openly on public radio that parents don't have the right to teach their children these religious beliefs because it goes against this one world government society that they're after here. C.F. Potter again. So again, this is the man that established the first humanist societies in New York and signed the Manifesto 1. Well, he knew again how to propagate that belief. He says, education is thus the most powerful ally of humanism, and every school, American school, is a school of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of the 5-day program of humanist teaching? So again, they were very clear in understanding what they could use to propagate their teaching on humanism. Horace Mann, another education leader back, I think, in the early 1900s, worked alongside Dewey. He says, what the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for democratic and rational man. God would be replaced by the concept of the public good. So here's an educator involved in the early days of the public education system, realizing what his agenda was, and we need to be aware of that. Here's John Dewey again, and we've seen him pop up a couple times. What did he really believe? Well, he said, there is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there is no need for the props of traditional religion. With the dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is also dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or moral absolutes. So John Dewey was pretty militant in how he viewed things, wasn't he, right? It's absolute. There is no God and there is no soul. Of course, he then goes on to talk about not having absolutes, but he certainly was absolutely convinced that there's no God. So here was one of the founding education leaders. 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay. All right. So here was one of the education leaders who was right there at the founding and of our public schools. And this is what he was thinking as he was doing that, right? He's sitting there thinking, this is what we're going to use to get rid of traditional religion, to get rid of God. You see some really wild statements from some individuals. This is a Harvard professor of education. So, when people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to Harvard to get this fantastic education so they can be amongst the elites in the education world, they get to listen to professors like this that say every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill. Why? Well, because he comes to school with certain allegiances toward our founding fathers and toward our elected officials, toward his parents, toward a belief in a supernatural being, toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. So, wow, they are just crazy, right? These 5-year-olds are crazy. And so here's why they're in this profession, right? It is up to you teachers to make all these sick children well by creating the international children of the future. So again, we see this world concept, right, where they're after this world government, world community, and that's going to require the children to be trained up in a certain way of thinking, and that includes not thinking about nations and not thinking about supernatural beings and so on and so forth. So, but it's the job of the teachers to make sure that happens, and certainly we can look in our news and see example after example of that happening today, where they're being called out for doing exactly that. Here we see another statement from a humanist that says we must ask how we can kill the God of Christianity. We need only to ensure that our schools teach only secular knowledge. If we could achieve this, God would indeed be shortly due for a funeral service. So, their language here, what does that tell you? Are they passive about this? They're not passive at all about this. They want to kill God in their language, right? In their own terms, and they want to see God dead. We see even worse language here in this one from another humanist, where he says, "I'm convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach." Haven't still quite figured out how they get into math, but they do. And notice, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or large state university, the classroom must and will become an area of conflict between the old and the new. the rotting corpse of Christianity and the new faith of humanism. So again, what is their image of how they want Christianity to end up? You know, did you have a question, Matt?
No, I was saying they are working math in. There was a recent interview, and there was someone, I think CNN was interviewing, they said that math is inherently racist. And so the question was, and the example given was 2 plus 2 may not always equal 4, and so by having that dogma that it does, it becomes a racist philosophy. So they are working their way into the math realm.
It'll be interesting to watch it when they start working for NASA.
2 plus 2 equals boom.
2 plus 2 equals boom. That's right. Anyway, you know, again, the language here, you know, the rotting corpse of Christianity, right? So, you know, the last slide we read, they want to kill God, and here they want to see this rotting corpse of Christianity. And we need to be thinking as students or parents or grandparents, do these statements alarm us? Well, you know, they ought to alarm us, right? There are people, again, this is not a passive thing. This is very, very active, and as Matt just pointed out, a very recent and real example that this is going on. We've got 4 minutes left. Is that right, Brett?
Yeah.
So we're just going to quickly touch a couple things here. I'm going to skip a couple of slides. Here, again, this is from the Humanist Manifesto 1. So this goes all the way back to 1933, where they realized that, hey, we've got to change the churches also. We can't just change the public schools. We also have to get into the churches. And so they talk about, evaluating these churches, transforming them, controlling them, with a view to the enhancement of human life is the purpose and program of humanism. So they want to be able to get in and change these churches to where the focus is on the human life. And here it says, certainly religious institutions, their ritualistic forms, ecclesiastical methods, and communal activities must be reconstituted. Well, reconstituted, that means having a different constitution, having a different fundamental basis by which you operate. So they realize the churches have to be changed at their foundation here, and they say as rapidly as experience allows, in order to function effectively in the modern world. One of the things that's interesting here, and this is some research that a brother and sister Daryl and Ruth Hanson, I believe they were from Texas, and the Johnsons know them or of them. Did some research, and one of the interesting things that they ran across was the fact concerning this Religious Education Association. So this is an association that publishes a lot of the Bible school material. It's been doing that since the early 1900s. And of course, we know these curriculums get used all over, not just the church, but in various denominations all over. But it's been used for over 100 years now. But it was founded by many of the same founders as the National Education Association. Well, who were they? Well, those were people like John Dewey, who were part of that. Now, does anybody remember anything that we read about John Dewey earlier? What did he say? We saw earlier, he said, there is no God and there is no soul, hence there is no need for the props of traditional religion. Now, why would John Dewey have any interest in the Religious Education Association and making Bible school material? He didn't even believe in God. Why? I mean, that just doesn't make sense, does it? Anybody want to?
Transformation and control.
Again, he understood he had a job to do, right? And he understood, hey, this is great. I can get right in at the foundation here, and we can create these materials that then go out and change these churches to be what we're after here. And so they became very actively involved in some of those things. And one more statement here, where they point out, that liberal theology puts man's needs central, and welfare programs, human rights campaigns, feeding the poor, caring for the sick, righting the wrong, thus become the central focus and an end in of themselves. Christianity is then seen only as a means of providing a moral framework to society. It makes the message of Christ serve humanity. So they're trying to steer the church into getting focused on all of these different programs that on the surface look like good programs, right? Feeding the poor. Well, what does Jesus want us to do? He wants us to feed the poor, doesn't he? But of course, that becomes the focus of what the humanists are trying to get the churches to do. That they get everybody involved in these programs, and that becomes the focus, not on changing the heart that naturally leads to those things. They're skipping that part and going straight for the social programs and trying to get all the churches to get engaged in these social programs. And that's when you go back and if you go to the site, you can look. They've got a whole bunch of pamphlets, for example, that they put together where they're trying to reach out to different religions and here, are you a Christian, right? And they try to talk about, well, you might be a humanist if you're a Christian, and given what we just talked about, you might wonder, well, how could they possibly make that argument? Well, when you go in and you look at the argument that they're fundamentally making, they go in, they hone in on the social programs, right? And they say, well, Christians are involved in these social programs like feeding the hungry and so on and so forth, and we do that too, right? And so they're trying to use that as the so-called common ground to say, well, you could be a humanist if you do those kinds of things. And they even point out in the article that there are some differences, but the very next thing that they do is they start to talk about, well, yeah, but there's differences among all the denominations about these as well, right? So they're very very subtle, very skilled about trying to persuade people into the right into their corner. Now, you get to the very end of the article though, and they point out this statement that one of these declarations made that says humanism can be a way of life for everyone, everywhere. But then they add this little thing to the very end of the article, says, including non-theist, free-thinking Protestants. Well, if you think about that statement, it's pretty contradictory, isn't it? A non-theist Protestant? I mean, a Protestant that doesn't believe in God. Well, I'm sure there's a few of them, but, again, here's this big, very slick brochure trying to hone in on the supposed commonalities, but in the very end, it's interesting to me that they're not giving up their ground. They're looking for liberal religious people to give ground, right? They're holding their ground. They're saying as long as you're a non-theist Protestant, we'll accept you. Okay, well, that one little word right there has a lot behind it, doesn't it? So we need to realize that they're very, very actively going after everyone, and we need to be watching out for that and realizing the different means that they're using, and especially those of us with children and grandchildren. We need to realize where these focus is in the schools and the media and things like that, and we need to get our kids out of those things, and because this is what's going on in those things.
Amen.